Candles had burned to their stubs in every chandelier of Hargreaves' house, yet still the ballroom blazed with something that could not quite be called light. It was performance. The concentrated effort of 400 people arranging themselves into tableaus of consequence. The orchestra played with the mechanical precision of men who understood their purpose was texture, not music. Gowns of ivory and sage and deep rose swept the parquet floor, each one chosen with the strategic attention of a commander selecting terrain. Diamonds flashed at throats. Fans opened and closed like arguments. Lord and Lady Hargreaves circulated through the room with the patient satisfaction of people whose guest list had been exactly what they intended it to be. And in the doorway, framed by two footmen who had been standing at attention for 3 hours, the Duke of Ashvale arrived. The room registered him before it registered anything else. That was how it always was with Marcus Cavendish, 5th Duke of Ashvale. He was tall and dark-coated, his cravat precisely folded, his tailcoat without a single unnecessary ornament. He did not pause in the doorway to allow the room to see him, which was precisely why the room could not stop looking. He moved through the gathered assembly as though completing an obligation that had been scheduled 6 months in advance, which it had. He nodded to 3 separate marquises, declined a glass of champagne without breaking stride, and positioned himself near the south wall with the air of a man calculating the shortest path to the exit. And at the edge of all that arranged brilliance, seated alone at the writing desk in the alcove beside the east window, a desk that had been placed there for correspondence and had not been used for correspondence in 4 years, was Charlotte Hartley, tallying the evening's accounts by candlelight. She was not a guest, she was not precisely a servant. She occupied the particular invisible territory between those two categories that English society had spent 2 centuries perfecting. The unmarried female relation who made herself useful enough to keep and unobtrusive enough to forget. She wore a gray dress she had worn to 3 previous Hargreaves entertainments. No one had noticed because no one had looked. She had a ledger open before her, a pencil in one hand, and her attention divided with practiced efficiency between the column of figures and the room beyond the alcove, which she was also managing. Charlotte noted the Duke's arrival the way she noted everything in that ballroom, quickly, completely, and without interrupting her work. She looked back at her ledger. He looked across the room, not at the gowns, not at the diamonds, not at the arranged tableaus. He looked at the alcove, at the desk, at the woman sitting there with a pencil and an open ledger in the middle of a ball. He did not move toward her. He simply held that particular attention for 3 long seconds, the way a person holds a note they are still deciding what to do with. Charlotte did not know he had looked. She was calculating the caterer's overcharge, which was 11 shillings and 4pence, and she was going to have it corrected before the invoice was signed. The most feared Duke in England feared nothing, everyone said. Everyone was wrong about the reason. Charlotte Hartley had been managing the Hargreaves household for 7 years, 4 months and 11 days, though she could have told you the figure in weeks if you had asked. She would not have said managing. She would have said helping, because that was the word Sir Edmund Hargreaves had given her when she arrived at 19, freshly bereaved of a father who had left debts instead of provisions, and Sir Edmund had said, with the particular warmth of a man who means to pay nothing, that his house would always be open to the daughter of his late cousin Gerald. She had understood within a fortnight what that meant. It meant the morning room accounts were hers to balance. It meant the cook answered to her on budget matters, though the cook was told to frame it as consulting with the mistress, whose interests Charlotte was merely representing. It meant the winter provision negotiations with the wool merchants of Derbyshire, a transaction that required knowing the current price per stone, the transportation cost differential between the northern and southern routes, and which merchant could be pressed for credit and which could not, fell to Charlotte, who conducted those negotiations at a table in the back office, while Sir Edmund signed the resulting agreements without reading them. It meant the three creditors who had begun sending increasingly pointed correspondence to Hargreaves' house in the winter of 1815 were managed by Charlotte, who had drafted a repayment schedule so precisely tiered that the most aggressive creditor, a Mr. Aldous Fenwick of Aldous Fenwick and Associates, had written back to say that whoever had prepared the proposal had done so with a clarity his own clerk could not match. The letter had been addressed to Sir Edmund. She had picked up her pencil and returned to the accounts. The person who receives no credit for keeping something standing rarely receives credit for it until it falls. Charlotte had understood this early. She did not spend energy lamenting it. She spent energy keeping things standing. Lady Hargreaves, Sir Edmund's wife, was not unkind in the way that some women of her station were unkind. She was simply absent, present in body, and absent in the particular attention that might have noticed Charlotte's actual function. She called Charlotte dear at breakfast, borrowed Charlotte's Spanish dictionary without returning it, and once told a visiting neighbor that Charlotte was very useful in that vague way, as though Charlotte were a footstool of moderate quality, rather than the operational mind of a household that employed 14 staff and maintained 3 properties. Charlotte had received, across 7 years, no salary. She had a room, meals, and an annual allowance of £12 for her dress. She had used it carefully. What she had done with the rest of her time, the time that was not already claimed by accounts, negotiations, staff management, and the steady invisible labor of keeping Sir Edmund's affairs from collapsing, was teach herself. She had worked through the estate ledgers from the previous 30 years in the library at Hargreaves' house, not because anyone asked her to, but because she needed to understand how an estate of this size worked across generations. She had borrowed, through the solicitor's office, the standard texts on agricultural tenancy. She had written, in the back pages of her personal notebooks, her own annotated analysis of where Hargreaves' income had declined and why, and what a person with the authority to act might do about it. No one had the authority to act. Charlotte had the analysis. There had been one moment, in the autumn of her 4th year, when she had come close to something that might be called despair. Sir Edmund had agreed, without consulting her, to a timber contract with a merchant named Greer, a contract that locked the estate into a price per cord that was 18 shillings below the prevailing rate, and bound them for 4 years. She had found it on the desk, already signed, already returned. She had sat in the back office with the contract in her hands, and understood what it would cost them, £212 over the term, against margins that were already drawn thin. She had pressed one hand briefly against the surface of the desk, very flat, very still. Then she had picked up her pencil and begun drafting the letter to Mr. Greer's attorney that would, over the following 6 months, renegotiate the penalty clause into something that gave them a viable exit at the 18-month mark. It had taken 4 letters and 2 personal conversations in which Charlotte stood very quietly in Sir Edmund's study and explained, with the calm precision of someone who has done her arithmetic, exactly what the contract cost, and exactly what the exit would cost, and exactly why the exit was the better number. Sir Edmund had told his attorney it had been his own thinking all along. She was not going to step aside from what she knew, simply because the world had arranged itself to pretend she didn't know it. That had been her decision at 22, and she had not revisited it. She had been seen, once, clearly. A retired estate manager named Mr. Horatio Finch, brought in to assess the Hargreaves properties in the summer of her 3rd year, had spent 2 hours in the accounts room with Charlotte, going through the ledgers, and had sat back at the end and said, with the particular surprise of a man who is not expected to be surprised, that he did not often see this quality of analysis from anyone, let alone from someone with no formal training. He had said it quietly and without condescension. Charlotte had thanked him. He had gone back to his own county, and no one had said anything further. She had held that moment for a long time afterward, not with longing but with purpose. Someone had seen it once. That meant it was possible to be seen. She had returned to her accounts. Marcus Cavendish had requested the file on the Hargreaves household 7 weeks before the Hargreaves ball. He had not told his secretary why, which meant his secretary had done his best with limited instruction, and the resulting file had included the household staff list, Sir Edmund's published financial history, and a 1-paragraph note on Sir Edmund's unmarried female relation, a Miss Charlotte Hartley, age 26, daughter of the late Gerald Hartley of Cheshire, resident at Hargreaves House for approximately 7 years, no recorded income, no marital prospects, described by the investigator's contact as very capable, in a way that seemed to mean more than it usually did. Marcus had read that line 3 times. He was a man who had spent 11 years managing an estate the size of a small county, and he knew precisely what very capable in a way that seemed to mean more than it usually did indicated. It indicated someone who was doing work that someone else was taking credit for. He had seen it once before, in his mother's household, where his mother had managed the Cavendish estate correspondence, tenant negotiations, and household accounts for 22 years, while his father received the credit. He had understood what he was seeing, as a boy, without having the language for it. He had the language now. His mother had been dead for 8 years. He had been alone in Ashvale Park since then, not by sentiment but by the practical removal of the one person who had made the house feel like something other than an administrative task. He was not, by nature, a demonstrative man. He had no gift for the performance of warmth that English social occasions required, and he had long since stopped trying to acquire it. What he had was precision, a good memory, and the particular quality of attention that comes from years of solitude. He had gone to the Hargreaves ball because he had received a report. He had arrived intending to observe. He had positioned himself near the south wall with the specific purpose of finding a moment to look at the alcove by the east window, which his investigator had mentioned, briefly, in a follow-up note. She works from the alcove desk at Hargreaves Entertainments, managing costs and staff while the family entertains. She has never missed a single function in 7 years, though she attends none of them. Marcus had looked at the alcove. He had seen a woman in a gray dress with a ledger open before her and a pencil in her hand, tallying columns while 400 people arranged themselves into performance around her. He had felt something he did not immediately name, because he was not given to naming things before he understood them. It was the specific quality of recognition, like a note that has been correctly resolved after a long dissonance. He had made 3 decisions in the following minute, standing by the south wall with his champagne untouched in a passing footman's tray. He would request an introduction through conventional means. He would speak to his solicitor, and he would attend 2 more Hargreaves social occasions, because he was not a man who acted on a single data point. He attended the morning concert at Hargreaves House 12 days later. Charlotte was there, not as a guest but arranging the program cards at the door, which she had organized, printed at her own direction, and placed in alphabetical order by performer's surname. He watched her speak to a footman about a missing music stand, correct the problem in under 4 minutes, and return to the door without any apparent alteration in her composure. Then he walked up to the door and said, "You alphabetized the program cards by performer." Charlotte looked at him. He had clearly been announced at the door, and clearly had his invitation, and she registered all of that in 1 second. "It is easier for guests to find the pieces they wish to hear," she said. "Most households list by performance order. Performance order tells you nothing about what you're going to hear. This tells you who is performing, then lets you find the order." He held the card. A practical decision. "Yes," she said. He went inside. He did not stop looking at her program card for the remainder of the concert. 2 weeks after the concert, Marcus attended a small dinner at Hargreaves' house to which he had specifically requested, through his secretary, to be added. Charlotte was not at the dinner table. She was in the kitchen managing a crisis involving the second course, which had been prepared with the wrong fish, a substitution she had caught at the last moment and redirected with 6 minutes in a cold pantry. The dinner went flawlessly. Marcus noticed the second course delay and then its resolution, and understood what it meant. He had, by then, made his fourth decision. He spoke to Sir Edmund in the library after dinner, while the remaining guests were in the drawing room. He was brief and specific. Sir Edmund, who was the kind of man who could not quite follow why a Duke of Ashvale would want his unpaid female relation as a household manager, but who was not the kind of man who questioned a duke, said that of course Charlotte was at their disposal. Charlotte did not know any of this until a Tuesday morning in October, when Lady Hargreaves informed her, over the breakfast table, that she was going to Ashvale Park. The drive to Ashvale took 4 hours in a hired carriage, because Charlotte would not allow anyone to go to the expense of sending the Hargreaves equipage, which would be needed for Sir Edmund's business in 2 days' time. She brought one trunk, her personal notebooks, and the analysis she had been writing for 3 years in the back pages of those notebooks. The analysis she had told herself was simply for her own understanding, and had not quite admitted was for the day when someone might ask. Ashvale Park announced itself before it was visible. The road improved. The hedgerows were managed with the precision of people who knew what they were doing. The gate lodge was occupied and in good repair. Charlotte noted these things the way she noted everything, and when the house came into view at the end of the avenue, 3 stories of warm stone, symmetrical, serious, surrounded by grounds that had been maintained to a standard that was functional, rather than showy, she felt something that might have been recognition. She had been given no formal brief for her role at Ashvale, which meant her first task was to establish what it actually was. She began before the carriage had fully stopped. The housekeeper, a woman of 50 named Mrs. Agnes Dove, was waiting at the servants' entrance. She looked at Charlotte with the careful assessment of a woman who has dealt with too many short-term interventions by people who understood nothing of how houses worked and who had decided to form no opinions until she had evidence. Charlotte said, "I would like to see the household accounts for the past 12 months, the current staff roster, and the outstanding service contracts, if you would be willing to show me. I am not here to change things that are working. I am here to understand what is working." Mrs. Dove's expression shifted by a fraction. "The accounts are in the morning room," she said. "I'll have tea brought." This was the first genuine welcome Charlotte had received in a house that was not her own, since she was 19 years old. She recognized it for what it was, and did not take it for granted. The accounts were in better shape than those of any estate Charlotte had managed or analyzed in 7 years. Whoever had been handling the bookkeeping, a young man named Mr. Preston, it emerged, who had been managing the Ashvale books for 3 years, had done competent work. But competent was not the same as thorough, and thorough was not the same as strategic. Within 2 days, Charlotte had found 3 things: a recurring overcharge from the estate's coal merchant that had been present in the books for 6 years undetected, totaling approximately £74 in accumulated excess cost, a timber contract with a favorable renegotiation clause at the 18-month mark that no one had exercised, now 4 months past its window but potentially recoverable, and an agricultural tenancy agreement in the north quarter of the estate that had been written, 11 years ago, in terms so vague that the tenant was paying 40% below what comparable tenancies in the county were fetching, and had been doing so for over a decade. She wrote all of this in her notebook in 3 columns: what was, what it was costing, and what a corrective action would yield. The total recoverable annual improvement was somewhere between £200 and £240, depending on the tenancy renegotiation. She did not present this to Marcus immediately. She needed to verify the coal merchant figures against independent price records, which she located in the solicitor's correspondence files, and she needed to understand whether the North tenancy situation had any human complexity. The tenant in question, a Mr. Elias Hartop, had been there for 30 years and might have an informal understanding with the previous Duke. She did not want to optimize a number at someone's genuine expense. She asked Mrs. Dove about Mr. Hartop. Mrs. Dove said he was a fair man who paid reliably and had never missed a quarter. Charlotte said she would need to visit the North Quarter. Mrs. Dove said she would arrange it, and then looked at Charlotte with the particular expression of a woman revising an opinion she had not yet committed to. "You want to see the man himself," Mrs. Dove said. "I want to understand the situation completely before I recommend anything," Charlotte said. Mrs. Dove nodded. She did not say anything further, but she had the horse and trap ready the following morning at 8. It was during those first 2 weeks that the other occupants of Marcus's world began to take notice of Charlotte's presence. There were 3 who mattered. The first was Lord Gerald Cavendish, Marcus's father, who maintained rooms at the west end of Ashvale Park when he was in residence. He was 71, sharp-minded, and had made the match between his son and Miss Eugenia Pemberton, daughter of the Earl of Dorset, a matter he considered functionally settled, despite the fact that Marcus had never agreed to it. Lord Gerald looked at Charlotte at the first household dinner he attended and said, to no one in particular, that he understood Ashvale had taken on a new arrangement regarding household management, which would naturally be a temporary one. The second was Miss Eugenia Pemberton herself, who arrived for a planned visit to her mother's friend at the neighboring estate of Caldervane, and called at Ashvale with the assurance of a woman who has been measuring a house for her own furniture. She was beautiful, socially precise, and genuinely intelligent. Charlotte recognized the intelligence immediately and did not underestimate it. Eugenia looked at Charlotte with the calm assessment of a woman who has categorized a threat correctly and has not yet decided whether it requires action. The third was a woman named Miss Harriet Voss, who was not interested in Marcus at all, and was the best thing that happened to Charlotte in the first month at Ashvale. Harriet was 28, a neighbor's daughter, direct to the point of social imprudence, and had been told by a mutual acquaintance that the woman managing Ashvale's household was doing something genuinely interesting with the accounts. She appeared at the morning room door on a Tuesday with a piece of embroidery she had not been embroidering, and said, without preamble, "Are you actually renegotiating the coal contract?" "I have sent a letter to Mr. Baines's office," Charlotte said, without looking up from the letter she was composing. "I expect a response by Thursday." "No one has ever questioned Mr. Baines," Harriet said, sitting down uninvited with the ease of someone who considers social formality a voluntary exercise. "He has been overcharging half the county for years. Everyone knows it." "Then it should be relatively simple to demonstrate," Charlotte said. She looked up. "Do you know what the current open market price per ton is from the Nottingham merchants?" Harriet blinked. Then she smiled. "I know exactly who to ask," she said. "My brother deals with them directly." That was the beginning of what Charlotte would have called a practical friendship, which was the only kind she had allowed herself for a long time. Harriet was the first person since old Mr. Finch in the accounts room who looked at Charlotte without calculating what she might be useful for. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like friendship. This one, she thought, was real. Marcus did not speak to Charlotte in a business capacity until the end of her first week, which she had been told to expect. He was in London for 3 days after her arrival, and when he returned, he had the particular contained quality of a man who had not stopped working for the duration of the journey. He came to the morning room. He looked at the opened ledgers on the desk. He looked at Charlotte. "You found something," he said. "3 things," she said, and presented the notebook. He read it standing, which she noted because it meant he had not decided to be comfortable yet. He read in silence for 4 minutes. When he was finished, he looked up and said, "The tenancy." "Mr. Hartop," Charlotte said, "I visited him yesterday. He is not aware of the discrepancy. He has been paying what the original agreement specified, and no one has renegotiated in 30 years. He's a good tenant. The North Quarter is the best maintained land on the estate. I would not recommend simply raising the rate. I would recommend a phased adjustment over 3 years with a capital improvement clause so that the increase comes with something tangible." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Why the capital improvement clause?" "Because he has been there for 30 years at an unfair rate and has maintained the land fairly. He is owed something for that, and it will be cheaper to honor that than to lose a good tenant through an aggressive renegotiation." Marcus looked at her for a moment longer than was required by the transaction. "Draft the proposal," he said. "I will review it before you contact his representative." He left. Charlotte returned to her notebook. She did not allow herself to examine what she had felt during that 4 minutes while he read. She picked up her pencil and went on. The coal merchant's office sent a reply on Thursday, as she had expected, that was defensive in the first paragraph and conciliatory in the second. Charlotte wrote the response herself, citing the independent price records from 3 alternative suppliers and the accumulated 6-year overcharge figure of £74, and offered a revised rate going forward and a partial credit against the following year's supply, framing it as the correction of a clerical error rather than an accusation. The tone was precise and unhurried. Mr. Baines agreed within the week. The credit was 4 months' coal. Marcus read the exchange in his study on a Friday evening and found Charlotte in the morning room after dinner, which he had not done before. "The Baines correspondence," he said. "Was there a difficulty?" Charlotte asked. "None." He set the folder on the desk beside her. "I want to understand the reasoning behind the credit framing. If you accuse a merchant of fraud, he defends himself and the relationship ends badly. If you correct a clerical error, he accepts the correction, and you retain a supplier who now has a reason to be careful with you." Marcus was silent for a moment. "My mother used to say something similar," he said. It came out without preparation, which was not his usual mode, and he seemed to register this because he looked slightly to the left of Charlotte rather than directly at her. "She managed the estate correspondence for 20 years. Charlotte said nothing. She understood that he was not continuing to speak, and that the pause required no filling. He remained in the doorway for another moment. Then he said, "Good evening, Miss Hartley," and left. She sat with the folder and the candlelight, and the knowledge that he had said something true and private, and had not intended to, and that he had trusted the room enough to say it anyway. She pressed one hand flat against the surface of the desk, very briefly. Then she picked up her pencil and went on. The romance, though neither of them had used that word, and would not for some time, accumulated in the spaces between business. In the library, where Marcus had developed the habit of working in the evenings, and where Charlotte had begun to bring her research materials, because the morning room fire was always allowed to go out after dinner, and the library fire was always lit. They did not always speak. They worked on opposite sides of a large table, and the silence between them was of the particular quality that belongs to two people who have stopped finding silence uncomfortable in each other's company. One evening Charlotte looked up and found that Marcus had pushed his own papers to the side and was reading her annotated notebook, the analysis of the Ashvale accounts, the 3 columns of what was, what it cost, and what the correction would yield. He had not asked. He did not seem to realize she had looked up. She watched him read. He read the way he did everything, completely, without performance. He turned a page, read, turned another. She said, "That is a working document." He looked up. He did not look embarrassed. "You analyzed the entirety of the estate accounts across 12 months in under a week," he said. "And then you went to visit a tenant before you would recommend anything about him." "That is how it should be done," Charlotte said. "Yes," he said. "It is." He returned the notebook to her side of the table without further comment. But she noticed, over the following week, that the North Quarter tenancy proposal, which she had drafted and submitted for his review, came back to her with a single annotation in his handwriting in the margin. "The capital improvement clause you proposed is correct." He had not changed a word of the clause itself. There was the evening in the music room, which she had not intended. She had gone in to check the condition of the piano, which Mrs. Dove had said was in want of tuning, and had found herself sitting at it in the dusk with no particular intention, playing a piece she had learned from her father, a small, serious composition by an unfashionable composer, not showy, not pretty, with a harmonic resolution that had always felt to her like something coming exactly right after a long uncertainty. She did not hear Marcus come in. She was not sure when he arrived. When she stopped playing, she became aware, by the quality of the stillness, that someone was in the doorway, and she turned. He was standing at the threshold in his shirt sleeves, which she had not seen before. He had apparently come from his private study and not anticipated encountering anyone in the music room at this hour. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was not surprise, or not only surprise. "Your pardon," she said. "I should not have." "My mother played that composition," he said. Charlotte was quiet. She played it every Sunday evening. She said she had learned it from her own mother. He was looking at the piano rather than at Charlotte. "I have not heard it since she died," Charlotte said after a moment. "I am sorry. I did not know." "No," he looked at her. "Please don't apologize." She did not. She set her hands in her lap and looked at him steadily, and he looked back, and the room was very quiet. He said after a moment, "Will you play it again?" She turned back to the piano and played it again. He did not move from the doorway. She could hear him breathing, very quietly, in the stillness of the room. When she finished, he said, "Thank you," in a voice that had no performance in it at all. She said, "Good night, Your Grace." He said, "Good night, Miss Hartley." She gathered her candle and walked past him in the doorway, close enough to see that his expression had not changed, was still that particular stillness that was not composed, but was something more honest than composure, and went back to the morning room. She did not sleep for a long time, but she did not examine the reason. She had a coal credit to record and a tenancy proposal to finalize, and she was not the kind of person who lingered in the music room of her own mind when there was work to be done. The cravat incident occurred on a Wednesday morning in November, 11 days before the events that changed everything. Marcus was preparing to leave for a county magistrate's meeting that he attended quarterly, and Charlotte was in the entrance hall reviewing a delivery receipt with the under-steward when Marcus came down the stairs, and she saw, immediately, that his cravat was folded incorrectly, a diagonal pull in the left fall that would have been invisible in a mirror but was plainly apparent from the angle of the hall. She said nothing for a moment. She finished the delivery receipt. She signed it and returned it to the under-steward. Then she said, without particular ceremony, "Your cravat has been folded incorrectly. It will pull loose before you reach the village." Marcus stopped walking. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has been met with a precision he did not expect. Charlotte stepped forward, reached up and adjusted the fold with 2 movements, the kind of 2 movements that come from having thought about the geometry of the thing rather than from having done it before, and stepped back. It took perhaps 8 seconds in total. "It has been that way since breakfast," she said. "I noticed it at 9 o'clock. It is now 22 minutes past 11. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, "You allowed me to wear a defective cravat for 2 hours and 22 minutes. "I was completing the delivery receipt," Charlotte said. "Priorities." He looked at her for another moment. Something moved through his expression that was not quite amusement, but lived in the same neighborhood. He said, "Thank you, Miss Hartley. and went out the door. Charlotte returned to the morning room. She noted in her log that the delivery had arrived short by 1 case of lamp oil, picked up her pencil, and continued. It was Harriet who told Charlotte, a week before the investor meeting, that the trouble was more serious than a coal contract. Harriet arrived at the morning room with her embroidery and without ceremony on a Thursday morning and said, "There is a rumor circulating among the county families that Ashevale is considering a major agricultural modernization. My brother says 3 of the northern investors who hold notes against the estate are concerned about the capital outlay." Charlotte set down her pencil. "Which investors?" "Fenwick, Aldershot, and a man named Crail, who is newer and worse." Charlotte had heard of Fenwick, the same Fenwick whose firm had received her letter about Sir Edmund's creditor repayment 6 years ago. She had read the man's correspondence style. She knew how he thought about money. "What is the concern precisely?" she said. "That the Duke intends to modernize the North Quarter on credit, which will extend the estate's exposure before any return is realized. Crail is saying, and I have this from my brother who heard it directly, that there is no one at Ashevale capable of managing a project of that scale competently, and that without experienced oversight, the capital risk is unacceptable." Charlotte was quiet for 1 moment. Then she said, "When is the investor meeting?" 12 days from now, Harriet said, watching her. "Crail has called it." Charlotte nodded once. She opened the notebook to a clean page and began to write. She had 12 days. She spent them with a precision that she had never applied to anyone else's problem, because this one was hers, in a way she did not fully examine, and did not need to. She requested the full agricultural accounts for the past 15 years from Mr. Preston, and received them within a day, because she had already established a working relationship with him that was based on mutual respect and clear requests. She visited the North Quarter twice more, taking measurements and notes. She wrote to a contact of Mr. Finch's, the retired estate manager who had seen her clearly in the Hargreaves library years ago, and received by return post a detailed account of the modernization approach that 3 comparable estates in the Midlands had taken, including their capital timelines and their realized returns. She drafted the financial model in her notebook and then transferred it, in clean columns, to 3 sheets of the best paper from the Ashevale stationery supply. She annotated each figure with its source. She included a comparison table. She built a 5-year projection that was conservative. She had made the estimates deliberately restrained, because a projection you can beat is more useful than one you can't reach. She presented the draft to Marcus on a Monday evening in the library. He read it as he always read, completely and in silence. He turned the pages. He looked at the comparison table. He read the projection. He set the papers down and said, "Where did you find the Midlands figures?" "A contact," she said. "A retired estate manager who assessed Hargreaves properties 6 years ago. He has been watching the modernization outcomes in his county for a decade, and the capital timeline is conservative by approximately 15%. I have kept it restrained because I want the actual results to exceed the projection, not match it." Marcus looked at her. "You intend to present this at the investor meeting, if you will permit me to do so." He was quiet. She understood what the quiet meant. It meant he was calculating not whether the analysis was correct, which he had apparently already determined, but what it would mean, in that room, for her to be the one to stand up and say it. "Crail will not be polite," he said. "I did not expect politeness," Charlotte said. "I expected evidence to be more useful than politeness, in any case." Marcus looked at the papers again. He said, "I will introduce you as Ashevale's estate analyst. You will have the floor for as long as you need it." Charlotte said, "I will not need long." The investor meeting was held in the formal dining room at Ashevale, which had been arranged with the investors' comfort in mind. which meant a long table and a great deal of authority implied by the seating. Fenwick was there, older than the name she remembered from a letter, but recognizable in his manner. Careful, precise, skeptical by profession. Aldershot was a large-framed man who appeared to make decisions based on whether they made him feel confident. Crail was younger than she had expected, with the particular assurance of a man who has been in too few rooms where he was wrong. Lord Gerald was there as well, which had not been announced to Charlotte, and which she registered without breaking stride. He sat at the far end of the table in the manner of a man who considers himself the most important person present, but is allowing the proceedings to go through their form before he makes that clear. Eugenia Pemberton was not in the room, but Charlotte was aware, in the way she was aware of most things, that Eugenia had arrived at Caldervane the previous day. Marcus introduced Charlotte in exactly the terms he had said he would. Ashvale's estate analyst, in charge of the household and agricultural accounts. He said it without apology or qualification, in the same tone he used for everything, which was the tone of a man making a statement of fact. Crail looked at Charlotte with an expression that communicated, without quite saying, that he was about to make the proceedings very unpleasant for everyone. He said, "I was not informed that the Duke's household manager would be presenting financial strategy." Charlotte set her 3 pages on the table. "I am the estate's analyst," she said. "I have been managing the household accounts and the agricultural ledgers for the past 6 weeks. Before this morning, I identified 3 recurring discrepancies in the estate's supplier contracts that have now been resolved, recovering an annual improvement of approximately £216. I am presenting the modernization proposal because I prepared it. Would you like me to begin?" Crail said. "On whose authority?" "On mine," Marcus said, from the head of the table. He said it without raising his voice. The room adjusted. Charlotte began. She went through the Midlands comparison first. 3 pages of data from estates that had undertaken similar modernization over the previous decade, with their capital investment, their timeline to positive return, and their current agricultural yield compared to pre-modernization baselines. She cited each source by name and county. She presented the North Quarter assessment next, the measurements, the current yield, the projected improved yield under the drainage and crop rotation scheme she had outlined, and the comparison against the current tenancy rate. She presented the financial model last, walking through each year of the 5-year projection with its conservative assumptions explicitly labeled. She did not argue, she did not plead. She presented each figure in sequence and allowed the figures to be what they were. Aldershot asked 2 questions, both reasonable. She answered both specifically and completely. Fenwick looked at the comparison table for a long time. He looked up and said, "You said the Midlands projections were independently sourced." "From Mr. Horatio Finch," Charlotte said, "retired estate manager of 31 years' experience in Derbyshire and Leicestershire. I have his letter of attestation if you wish to see it." She had it in the folder she had brought. She set it on the table. Fenwick picked it up and read it. He set it down. He said nothing, which was, she had found, what a careful man says when he has been given information he cannot contradict. Crail said, "This is all very organized, but the question of who has the authority and experience to execute a modernization of this scale." "I do," Charlotte said. "I have been managing agricultural accounts, tenant negotiations, and capital expenditure decisions for 7 years. I have renegotiated supplier contracts at 2 separate properties. I have produced the analysis before you, which you are free to verify against independent sources. If there is a specific element of the execution plan you are uncertain about, I am happy to address it." Crail looked at her with an expression that was recalibrating in real time, without quite admitting it. He said, "The execution requires ongoing oversight." "Yes," Charlotte said, "which is why I have outlined a quarterly review structure in the final page. You will note that the review milestones are tied to realized yield figures rather than to projected ones. You are not being asked to trust a forecast. You are being asked to fund an expenditure against measurable outcomes. The room was very quiet. Fenwick said with the careful tone of a man correcting a view he had held for years. The quarterly review structure is sound. Aldershot said he was satisfied with the proposal, which meant he was not going to vote against it. Crail said nothing further that was useful. Lord Gerald had not spoken throughout the presentation. He was looking at the 3 pages of figures with an expression Charlotte could not fully read from her angle, which was something between what he had expected and what he had found instead. He said, at last, addressing Marcus rather than Charlotte, "Your estate analyst appears to have done her work thoroughly." It was not an apology, it was not warmth. It was the acknowledgement of a man who had formed a position based on a category and had found the category insufficient. Charlotte did not expect more than that, and she did not need it. Marcus said, from the head of the table, "She has." He looked at Charlotte. Then he did something she had not anticipated. He stood up, which drew all eyes to him, because people always looked at Marcus when he moved, and he walked to the side of the table where Charlotte's papers were spread, and he picked up the 5-year projection and held it up for the room to see. "These figures were prepared entirely by Miss Hartley," he said. "The Ashvale modernization will proceed under her direction. If any of you have questions about the execution, you will address them to her." He set the paper down. "The motion before this group is approval of the capital allocation. I am recommending approval. Miss Hartley's analysis supports it. You have the documentation before you." The vote was 3-1 in favor. Crail voted against, which surprised no one, and which made his objection part of the record rather than the outcome. The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment, the particular stillness of a space in which the weight of what has just happened has not yet been distributed among the people present. Then Fenwick began gathering his papers, and Aldershot said something about the weather, and the meeting concluded with the particular English efficiency of men who have decided to behave as though the previous hour was simply business, which was, Charlotte thought, the most useful thing they could do. Marcus remained at the table as the investors filed out. Lord Gerald moved toward the door and paused beside Marcus without looking at Charlotte. He said, very quietly to his son, "She is not what I assumed." He went out. Marcus looked at Charlotte. The room was empty except for them. He said, "Are you all right?" She considered the question with the same attention she gave everything. "Yes," she said. "Crail was less organized than I expected. It made the last section easier." The corner of Marcus's mouth moved in a way she had seen once before, in the entrance hall, after the cravat. She had decided she liked it very much, and was not going to say so. She began gathering her papers. He remained where he was, watching her. She was aware of him watching her in the way that she was aware of most things, quickly, completely, without interrupting her work. He said, "Miss Hartley." She looked up. He said, "Charlotte." She had not heard her first name from him before. She held very still. He said, "I am going to ask you something this evening. When I do, I would ask you to give it a full and considered answer, rather than a convenient one." She said, "I always do." "Yes," he said, "I know." He left the dining room. Charlotte stood with her papers and her folder and the particular physical stillness of a woman who is not going to allow herself to make assumptions, and after a moment she picked up everything she had brought and returned to the morning room. She spent the afternoon finalizing the North Quarter improvement schedule, because there was work to be done and she was not going to let an unspecified evening conversation unbalance her arithmetic. He found her in the library that evening, where she had been for 2 hours. The fire was lit. The candles were burning. She had finished the schedule and moved on to the preliminary draft of the first quarterly review framework. She heard him come in and looked up. He was in his coat rather than his shirt sleeves, which meant he had been thinking about this as a formal occasion. She noted it. He sat down across from her, not at the head of the table where he usually sat, but directly across, which meant he was in her line of sight rather than at an angle. She set down her pencil. He said, "I have done this once already, at a dinner at my solicitor's office 3 weeks ago, in the presence of Sir Edmund and Mr. Alderton, because the situation required a formal arrangement to have any practical legitimacy. You were told only that you were coming to Ashvale to assist with household management." Charlotte said carefully, "You arranged a formal arrangement." "I did. It gives you legal standing here, a contract of employment with defined terms, which means your work is credited to you, and your position is not dependent on anyone's goodwill, including mine." He looked at her steadily. "That was the arrangement that was required. This is something different." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most precise person I have encountered in 11 years of managing this estate alone. Because you went to visit Mr. Hartop before you would recommend anything about him. Because you played my mother's composition in the dark without knowing it was hers, and when I told you, you asked to play it again rather than apologizing. Because you corrected my cravat and told me it had been wrong since 9 o'clock as though this were a simple fact of nature." He paused. "Because I have been alone in this house for 8 years and I did not know what I was missing until you arrived and put it to work." Charlotte sat with that for a moment. She thought about it completely, because she had never made a decision by not thinking about it, and she was not going to start now. She said, "You understand that I will continue to have opinions about the accounts." "I would be alarmed if you did not," he said. "And the cravat situation will not improve. I expect it to worsen, if anything." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the particular steadiness of a man who has said the true thing and is waiting to see what you do with it. She said yes. He reached across the table and took her hand, her bare hand, which was ink-stained at the first finger from the afternoon's drafting, and held it in both of his. He did not say anything further. He did not need to. It was the gesture of a man who makes his decision and holds it. Charlotte held still. She was aware of the fire, the candles, the quiet of the library, the papers spread on the table between them, the specific weight of his hands around hers. She was not going to become less than she was. She had decided that at 22, and she did not revise decisions made from good reasons. She turned her hand over and held his. They were married in December, at Ashvale, in the presence of 17 people who mattered, and several dozen who were simply in the county. Charlotte wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had bought with the first installment of her actual salary, because she had a salary now, formal and documented and filed with the estate solicitor, and she had spent precisely the portion of it she had allocated to the wedding and no more. Harriet Voss stood beside her, wearing green and looking indignant on Charlotte's behalf at Lord Gerald, who was behaving correctly if not warmly. Mr. Alderton, the estate solicitor, who had recognized what Charlotte was doing 6 weeks before anyone else of consequence had said so, stood near the door with the satisfied expression of a man whose professional judgment has been confirmed. Mrs. Dove had arranged the flowers herself and refused any assistance with them. Eugenia Pemberton did not attend. She had, it was reported, received a very favorable offer from a young baronet in the autumn, and had accepted it with the crisp efficiency of someone redirecting their plans without excessive sentiment. Charlotte bore her no ill will. The system had offered Eugenia certain advantages, and Charlotte had had none of them. The outcome had still gone differently than the system intended. That was, Charlotte thought, sufficient. Lord Gerald spoke to Charlotte privately for 4 minutes after the ceremony. He said that he had reviewed the North Quarter proposal thoroughly, and that the quarterly review structure was more rigorous than what he had seen from any estate manager he had employed. He said this as though he were discussing weather. Charlotte thanked him precisely and without warmth, because he had earned neither more nor less than that, and he seemed to understand it, because he nodded and moved away with the expression of a man adjusting an estimate he had been too slow to revise. The North Quarter modernization returned its first positive yield figures in the spring of the second year, 6% above the conservative projection Charlotte had presented at the investor meeting. She recorded the figure in the ledger, noted it against the projection, and added a single annotation, realized, ahead of schedule. She showed it to Marcus at the library table that evening. He read it, looked up, and said nothing. He simply reached across and turned the ledger so he could read it again from the proper angle. She let him. In the autumn of their second year, they had a daughter, born early in the morning with a great deal of energy and very little patience, which Marcus said was Charlotte's contribution, and Charlotte said was the most accurate thing he had said in months. They named her Eleanor, for Marcus's mother. She had dark hair and, from her earliest weeks, a fixed and evaluating gaze that fixed on things with the particular attention of a person who intends to understand whatever she is looking at completely before she moves on. Charlotte thought she recognized it. Marcus did too, and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of warmth. By Eleanor's second birthday, Charlotte had finished the annotated management framework she had been writing in the back pages of her notebooks for 3 years. The systematic account of how an estate of Ashevale's complexity could be managed for long-term yield rather than short-term liquidity, with specific models for tenancy renegotiation, supplier contract review, and capital improvement sequencing. She had it copied cleanly and sent copies, through Mr. Alderton's office, to 4 neighboring estates whose managers had requested access. Within 18 months, 2 further estates had written to ask for the full framework. She answered their letters herself, at the library table, in the evenings. Marcus came in from the grounds one October evening and found the library lit and warm, and Charlotte at the table with a letter half-drafted, and Eleanor asleep in the chair by the window where she had been put for a nap 2 hours ago and had not moved. Eleanor's boots, which were small and worn at the toes because she had a particular enthusiasm for gravel paths, were on the floor beside the chair. One of Charlotte's notebooks was open on the arm of the chair, which Eleanor had apparently been using before sleep found her. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room, the fire, the candles, the papers, the child with the notebook and the worn boots, the woman at the table who was writing with her first finger still ink-stained because it was always ink-stained, and something moved through his expression that was not complicated at all. Charlotte looked up. She knew he was there. She had known for perhaps 30 seconds, which was how long she had been allowing herself to stop writing and simply be in the room before she registered the question. She said she appropriated the notebook. "I see that," Marcus said. He came into the room, crossed to the chair, and carefully, without waking Eleanor, retrieved the notebook from the chair arm and set it on the table beside Charlotte's letter. He looked at his daughter for a moment. The dark hair, the fixed and evaluating expression softened now into the uncomplicated rest of a very small person who has spent the afternoon on gravel paths. He draped his coat over the back of the chair beside Charlotte's and sat down. Charlotte returned to her letter. He opened the estate ledger and found his page. The fire burned. Eleanor slept. The candles held their light steadily, without drama, the way a well-built thing does when it has been made to last. She was not the woman the world had arranged itself to ignore. She had always been exactly what she was. It had simply taken the right room, the right table, and one man who looked at an alcove desk at a crowded ball and understood, before he could have said why, that the most important person in the room was the one with the ledger.